The morning the doctors gave up on his son, Graham Alderton was standing by the window of the ICU, watching the St. Lawrence River through the glass. It was February. The ice had cracked along the far shore but hadn't fully broken. That's how he would remember it later. Everything suspended, waiting, not quite gone but not quite there either. Graham had built the largest private logistics network east of Toronto. He'd been on the cover of Business in Vancouver twice, turned down a Senate appointment, and once settled a labor dispute that 3 government mediators couldn't touch. People called him decisive, efficient, unshakable. He had never felt smaller in his life than he did in that hospital corridor. His son, Bennett, was 11 years old and had been unconscious for 9 days. It had started as something so ordinary it was almost embarrassing. A headache at school. The nurse sent him home. Graham's assistant picked him up because Graham was in a board meeting in Ottawa, and by the time Graham's phone buzzed with the first message, Bennett was already in the back of a car, pressing his forehead against the cool window glass, telling the driver it felt like something was pushing from the inside out. By evening, Bennett was in the emergency department at Montreal General. By midnight, they were talking about intracranial pressure. By morning, the word hemorrhagic had been used, and Graham had finally arrived, still in his suit, still carrying his briefcase, not yet understanding that he would not be going back to work for a very long time. The hemorrhage had been managed. The surgical team was excellent. Graham had made sure of that, had flown in a specialist from Vancouver within 48 hours, had paid for a second opinion from a neurosurgeon in Boston, who consulted by video from his living room on a Sunday evening. The bleeding had stopped. The damage, however, had not undone itself. The brain has a remarkable capacity for recovery, Dr. Petrov told him on day 4, and on day 6 she said something slightly different, and by day 9 the language had shifted in a way Graham couldn't quite define, but could absolutely feel, the way you feel a change in wind direction before you consciously register it. On day 9, Dr. Petrov sat down across from him in the family consultation room, a beige room with a fake fecus and 2 boxes of tissues on the table, and she said that Bennett's scans were not showing what they had hoped, that the areas affected included the brain stem, that while she could not predict the future, she wanted Graham to think about what Bennett would have wanted, what quality of life meant to his family, whether they wanted to continue aggressive intervention or begin to consider. Graham stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the beige room and down the corridor and into the stairwell, where he sat on a concrete step between the 2nd and 3rd floors and pressed the back of his head against the cinder-block wall and stared at the fluorescent light above him until it blurred. He had not cried. He didn't know why. He just sat there, very still, very empty, like a house after a fire. His ex-wife, Claire, arrived that evening from Edmonton. They hadn't spoken much in 3 years, not since the divorce, not since the custody arrangement that neither of them was fully satisfied with, but both had agreed to for Bennett's sake. She walked into the ICU waiting room and stopped when she saw Graham, and something in her face went soft in a way he hadn't expected, and she sat down beside him and didn't say anything for a long time, which was the right thing, and he was grateful. They took shifts. They spoke to doctors. They signed forms. They argued quietly in the corridor once about a feeding tube, and then apologized to each other with the stiff, formal courtesy of 2 people who had once loved each other very much and now were simply co-managing a catastrophe. Graham brought work to the hospital. He answered emails from the waiting room. He read reports in the cafeteria at 6 in the morning over coffee that tasted like cardboard. He did this because the alternative was sitting in a chair next to Bennett's bed, watching the ventilator breathe for his son, and he could only do that for so many hours before something in his chest started to feel dangerously loose. Bennett's room had a window that faced a small interior courtyard. In the courtyard, there was a bench, and on the bench, most mornings sat a girl. Graham noticed her the 3rd day after Claire arrived, so day 12. The girl looked about 10 or 11, dark-haired, wearing a yellow jacket that was a size too small, the sleeves not quite reaching her wrists. She sat on the bench with her knees together and a paper bag in her lap, and she seemed to be watching something. A sparrow that kept returning to the bare branch of the courtyard's single tree, a small linden that had been planted in a concrete planter, leafless now in February but very much alive. Graham thought nothing of it. He went back to his laptop, but she was there the next morning too. Same bench, same yellow jacket, and the morning after that. He asked a nurse about her on day 15. The nurse, a small Quebecois woman named Thérèse, who had been remarkably kind to both Graham and Claire, looked out the window and then back at Graham. "Her mother is a patient," Thérèse said. "Third floor. She comes every morning before school and sits with her. She's been doing it for 3 weeks. Who brings her? She takes the bus." Graham looked back at the girl on the bench. The sparrow had returned. The girl was holding out a piece of bread, very still, the way children learn to be still when they want an animal to trust them. "Alone," Graham said. "She's very independent," Thérèse said, with a tone that suggested she found this admirable and heartbreaking in equal measure. The next morning, Graham was in the cafeteria when the girl came in. She went straight to the counter, counted coins from a small zip pouch, and bought a cup of hot chocolate. Then she sat at a table near the window, took a notebook from her bag, and began doing what appeared to be homework. Graham didn't intend to speak to her. He genuinely didn't. He was reading a brief about a shipping delay in Halifax, and the cafeteria was quiet at 7 in the morning, and everything was fine until the girl looked up from her notebook and said, quite plainly, "Your son's in the ICU, right?" The boy in 14B. Graham set down his coffee. "Yes, I've seen you through the window, the courtyard window." She said it without embarrassment, just as a fact. "I sit out there, sometimes. I can see into the room a little. I saw you standing by his bed." "You're the one with the sparrow," Graham said. She nodded. "His name is Percy. I named him. He probably has another name, but I don't know what it is, so I call him Percy." She looked back down at her notebook. "My mum says naming things helps. It gives them somewhere to belong." Graham wasn't sure what to say to that. He asked her what her name was. "Nettie," she said. "Short for Annette. But nobody calls me Annette except my teacher when I'm in trouble. So, is your mother going to be okay?" Graham asked. It was the kind of question he wouldn't normally ask a stranger. He wasn't a man who invited emotional disclosure, but there was something about the cafeteria at 7 in the morning, the empty tables, the hiss of the coffee machine, that made the usual rules feel less applicable. Nettie was quiet for a moment. She capped her pen. "She has lupus," she said. "It flares sometimes. She'll be okay. She always is." She said it with the particular steadiness of a child who has been frightened many times and has learned to convert the fear into fact, to say the reassuring thing so many times that it starts to feel like it must be true. Graham understood that feeling. He'd been doing the same thing for 2 weeks. "I hope she gets better soon," he said. "Thank you," said Nettie. She uncapped her pen and went back to her homework. Graham returned to his brief. But he didn't read it. He sat there pretending to read it, thinking about what she had said. Naming things gives them somewhere to belong. And feeling, for reasons he couldn't have explained, slightly less alone. He saw Nettie the next morning, and the one after that. Their conversations were brief and oddly comfortable. She told him Percy the sparrow had been bringing pieces of string to the courtyard tree, which she took as a sign. He told her, without meaning to, that Bennett had been on his hockey team, that he'd been a decent center but an exceptional skater, that he'd asked for hockey skates for his birthday in March. Nettie listened to all of this without pity, which was remarkable, because pity was the thing Graham found most exhausting about talking to people at the hospital. Nettie just listened, the way a person listens when they understand that sometimes there is nothing useful to say. On day 18 she wasn't in the cafeteria. Graham found himself checking the window of Bennett's room toward the courtyard bench before he checked his phone in the morning, which was new and unexpected and made him slightly uncomfortable. She came on day 19, later than usual, with a small cloth bag he hadn't seen before. She sat across from him in the cafeteria and set the bag on the table. "My grandmother is visiting from Moncton," Nettie said. "She makes things." The bag contained a small glass jar of something dark and fragrant, dried lavender, dried chamomile, something else Nettie couldn't name, bound together with a piece of twine. There was also a folded piece of paper. "She wrote down what to do," Nettie said. "You put it near the bed. She says the smell matters, that the brain remembers things through smell, even when people think it isn't listening. She did it for my mum years ago, when she had her first bad flare. She says it's not medicine. She says it's just remembering, reminding the body what it knows." Graham looked at the jar. He looked at Nettie. "Your grandmother knows about my son. I told her about you. I hope that's okay. I told her he was a hockey player." Nettie folded her hands on the table. She said the body knows how to heal itself most of the time, that it just needs to remember that it wants to. Graham was a man who had paid 7 specialists. He had consulted research papers. He had requested second opinions from 3 countries. He was not, by any measure, someone who put stock in lavender and chamomile and folded notes from grandmothers in Moncton. He took the jar. He wasn't sure afterward exactly why. Maybe it was that Nettie had offered it without expectation, without the weight of hope that people usually pressed into his hands when they gave him things. Maybe it was that she had said the brain remembers, and it had snagged on something in him that the doctor's language, for all its precision, had not quite reached. Maybe it was simply that it was February, and he had been sitting in this hospital for almost 3 weeks, and he was very, very tired. He told Dr. Petrov about it because he felt he had to, and he expected her to be dismissive in the polite, professional way she had of being dismissive. Instead, she paused, and then said that olfactory stimulation had shown some interesting results in neurological cases, that there was no harm in it, that the research on sensory engagement for patients with altered consciousness was still evolving. She did not tell him it would work. She also didn't tell him it wouldn't. Graham put the jar on the windowsill of Bennett's room, on the side near the ventilator, where the air movement from the machine might carry it. He put on Bennett's hockey playlist, the one he'd found on the boy's phone, a loud, relentless mix of classic rock and pump-up anthems that Bennett had been building since he was 9, and that Graham privately found slightly exhausting, but that was so specifically Bennett that listening to it felt like being in the same room with him. He held Bennett's hand, which he had been doing anyway but now did with different attention, and he talked. He talked about the hockey team, about the season they'd had, about a goal Bennett had scored in November that Graham had replayed on his phone so many times he'd worn the memory smooth. He talked about the summer they'd spent in Cape Breton when Bennett was 6, the way the kid had refused to sleep indoors for 3 nights and had dragged his sleeping bag out to the deck and slept under the stars with complete, uncomplicated confidence. He talked, and the jar sat on the windowsill, and the music played quietly, and the ventilator breathed. Dr. Petrov came by on the morning of day 22 and reviewed the overnight readings. She didn't say anything at first. She went through the chart, and then she called for a nurse, and then she did a manual assessment that Graham watched from the corner of the room, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. His eyes tracked, she said. Graham uncrossed his arms. It may have been involuntary, she said carefully. It could be a reflex. I don't want to. She stopped. She looked at Graham, and then at Bennett, and then said more quietly, but his eyes tracked Graham. He followed my light. The next 3 days were not a recovery. They were more careful than that, more incremental, more frightening in certain ways than the stillness had been, because now there was something to lose. Bennett's pressure readings stabilized. A reflex that had been absent came back. He moved his left hand on day 24, not in response to anything, just moved it, just decided, in whatever way the brain decides things, that a hand was something it still knew how to use. Claire was there when it happened. She made a sound Graham had never heard from her before, something between a sob and a laugh, and she covered her mouth with both hands and sat down very hard in the chair by the bed. Graham stood by the window. He didn't trust himself to speak. Nettie was on the bench in the courtyard. He could see the yellow jacket, the small figure, the paper bag in her lap. Percy the sparrow was there too on the branch, doing whatever sparrows do in February in Montreal, surviving, mostly, which is its own kind of miracle. He went down to the courtyard, which he had never done before, and sat on the bench beside her. She looked at him, and he must have looked different than usual, because she said, "Something happened." He moved his hand, Graham said, moved it on his own. Nettie nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment, watching Percy on the branch. "My mum moved to a regular room this morning," she said, "away from the monitors." They sat there for a minute without talking. The February air was cold, but the sun was out, the low winter sun that comes in sideways and lights up everything gold and angular. The linden tree cast a thin shadow on the snow. "Your grandmother," Graham said. "I don't know her name." "Giselle," said Nettie. "I'd like to send her a letter, if that's all right." Nettie considered this. "She'd like that," she said. "She doesn't get a lot of mail." The recovery was 6 weeks more. Not easy weeks. There were setbacks, a fever in week 2, a recalibration of medication that sent everyone's anxiety spiking for 48 hours, a physiotherapy assessment that came back more mixed than they'd hoped. Bennett was transferred from the ICU to a neurological recovery ward. He began to open his eyes with intention rather than reflex. He recognized his father's voice before he recognized his face, which the physiotherapist said was normal, and which Graham filed carefully in the part of his brain that held things that were devastating but survivable. One afternoon in late March, Bennett looked at Graham and said, "Dad," just that, one word, slightly slurred, like it was coming from somewhere far back. Graham said, "Hey, bud." He managed to say it evenly, which was something he would consider for the rest of his life one of the more significant achievements of his career. Bennett came home in April. The apartment had been reorganized, everything on one level, thresholds removed, a rail in the bathroom, a schedule for the physiotherapist, who would come 3 times a week. Claire stayed for the first 2 weeks. Graham had asked her to, and she had come without making it a negotiation, which was a kindness he hadn't forgotten. The work of recovery, Graham found, was not dramatic. It was repetitive and unglamorous and occasionally infuriating, and there were days when Bennett refused the exercises, and days when he was too tired to eat, and days when the frustration of being a kid who used to skate like water and now had to concentrate to button his shirt would break open in him in ways that were hard to watch. Graham watched anyway. He didn't look away. Nettie visited once in late April with her mother. Her mother was named Solange, and she was small and quiet and not quite what Graham had expected, though he wasn't sure what he'd expected. She had Nettie's same directness, the same economy of expression, and she shook Graham's hand with both of hers and said, "She talked about your son every day. She was very kind to me," Graham said. "She's very kind," Solange agreed, with the simple pride of someone who knows exactly who their child is. Nettie brought Percy's branch, not Percy himself, obviously, but a piece of the linden branch from the courtyard, which she had found on the ground and apparently felt was worth saving. She gave it to Bennett, who held it, and turned it over in his hands with the focused, slightly solemn attention he now brought to most things. "Do you like birds?" Nettie asked him. "Yeah," Bennett said. "There's a sparrow at the hospital that I've been watching since February. He's building a nest. Is the nest good?" "It's excellent," Nettie said seriously. "He's very committed." Bennett looked at her, then he looked at the branch. Something in his face settled, just slightly, like a room when someone opens the window. Graham made a donation to the pediatric neurology unit, a significant one quietly arranged, nothing with his name on a plaque. He wrote to Giselle in Moncton. The letter took him 4 drafts. In the final version, he told her that he didn't fully understand what had happened, that the doctors had their explanations and he had paid careful attention to all of them, but that he had kept thinking about something her granddaughter had told him in a hospital cafeteria in February. The brain remembers. It just needs to be reminded that it wants to. He told her he thought there was something in that worth holding on to. He told her he was grateful. Giselle wrote back, 3 weeks later, on floral stationery in a rounded, unhurried hand. She said she was glad the boy was home. She said she didn't believe in remedies exactly, only in paying attention. Attention to what the body already knows, attention to the small things that surround a person when they're sick, the sounds and smells that are part of who they are. She said lavender was not magic. She said lavender was memory. She said her late husband had called it le rappel, the recall. She said she hoped the boy would skate again. He did. Not that season was gone. And the one after was partial, tentative, a few times on the backyard rink Graham built in November in a burst of optimism that he chose not to second-guess. But the following March, Bennett was on the ice at the arena in Westmount with the rest of the team, slower than before, still finding the timing in his left side, his helmet slightly crooked the way it always had been. Graham watched from the glass. He had his phone in his pocket, but he didn't look at it once. The rink was loud the way rinks are loud. That specific echo, blades on ice, the particular cold of indoor arenas, the way the fluorescent lights flatten everything into a bright, clean clarity. Bennett skated to center ice, took a pass, and lost it, and turned and came back for it, and that was fine. That was more than fine. Graham pressed one hand flat against the cold glass. He thought about Nettie on the bench in February, holding out bread to a sparrow, perfectly still, waiting with the patience that some children seem to arrive in the world with, The knowledge that trust takes time, that you cannot rush it, that sometimes the only thing you can do is hold out what you have and be patient and let what needs to happen, happen. Percy. The sparrow had completed his nest by March, Nettie had told him. She'd taken a photograph on her phone and sent it through Solange's number. The nest was wedged into the joint where the linden branch met the trunk, hidden in plain sight. Small and solid and very much there. Graham had saved the photo. He kept it in his phone between his emails and his calendar, in the middle of the ordinary life he had returned to, that he had almost not been given back. He still had the jar of lavender on his windowsill at home. He hadn't opened it again. It was enough just to know it was there. Small, dark, smelling faintly through the glass of something old and unhurried. Something that believed in memory, that believed the body knows its own way home, if you give it a reason to find the path. On the ice, Bennett turned again. Found his edge, pushed off, skated.